Hey everybody, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll start talking about chapter 4. So this first part, we're really going to go over a whole bunch of definitions. And once we kind of get through some of that, we're going to first we're going to introduce the topic, then we're going to get into a whole bunch of terms and kind of things we need to know. And then we'll really get into some of how some of these ideas will shape and kind of keep going through as we progress in the course. Maybe. Hold on. There we go. All right. So just to kind of put into perspective why it is we're going to talk about this. And the next, 2 chapters, really, when we talk about inequality in this section, we are going to talk about those marginalized groups. We're going to talk about how those marginalized identities match up with sexuality and how sexuality's marginalized identities end up having kind of an unfair shake when it comes down to our social systems. And just to give you some of the ideas on why these topics are so important, we still have 78 nations around the world that criminalize same-sex sexuality. And by criminalize, I mean you can be arrested, tortured, what have you, whatever their criminal justice system looks like. And in 7, I think we were at 9, I think we're down to 7 countries where same-sex sexuality is punishable by death. LGBTQ plus people face double marginalizations as refugees. So immigration policies are super vital to LGBTQ plus populations because when they are in a situation where they possibly live in one of these countries where it's a criminal behavior to have this identity or to be who they are, or even punishable by death, that immigration status as a refugee in order to flee those areas can be really tricky and can be really compacted with other issues due to our very interesting take on immigration here in this country. Now, there are other places in Europe and some places even outside of Europe where these identities as a refugee status are taken more seriously, and they do get out a little easier in some of the other countries. However, that's not always the case when it comes to trying to immigrate to America. We also still are having these big issues with hate crime and like domestic terrorism. One example of this is the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando in 2016, which killed 49 people and left 53 more injured. It was a really big deal. It was a shooting that happened at a gay bar in Orlando, Florida. And it was just a really, really horrific event that happened in our history and our recent history. There's been many of those. And then we also are seeing a really big decline in gay bars in America. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. And we'll get into some of that. And some of them are positive because there is a more growing acceptance in a lot of places. So needing of specific bars for queer people is declining in places like specifically in several counties in California and New York City. And some of the places where these first really started happening, there's been a lot less of a need to have specifically queer bars just because of the more overarching trends towards acceptance in some of those areas. However, there is many places where those are still very necessary to keep safe spaces, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go through this chapter. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and go into some terms, and that's where we're really gonna start through this. When we talk about social class as a construct, as a term, as an idea of something that we want to measure in the social sciences, Usually we're talking about socioeconomic status, which is the aggregate of various economic-based life aspects such as occupation, education level, type of employment, self direction in the workplace. So you're going to measure these based on a number of those components. But we also understand that classes divided into this hierarchical structure. And when they get measured, especially when we're talking about social surveys or trying to divvy out the class-based structure, it comes in many different ways. You can see it measured out in upper class, middle class, lower class, or working class, lower class. You can see it divvied out more often in social surveys. You're going to see more of this 6-tiered situation that I have on here, where it's upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and poverty class. And everyone within that poverty class is below the poverty line, which is a really, really low bar here in America. And it's something that has proportionally not increased in ways that it probably should relative to what things cost. We also talk about this relational notion of class. So how this hierarchy amongst our class-based system really amounts to control, this conflict and struggle for power, and is really ingrained in a system of oppression here in the United States and in elsewhere in the world. And we can look at this on a more global level, but for the purposes of this class, we're probably going to focus primarily on the US. And really it's just talking about how the amount of social power that wealth can garner, the amount of opportunity, the amount of accession, the amount of even like access to things, and especially the access to and ability to hoard resources. And we'll get into that again, kind of and how that plays out in terms of sexuality a little bit later in this lecture. And then we also understand class to be a social identity. It's an identity. It's something that we sometimes even wear, right? So like if you're wearing an expensive label, to an extent, you're going to wear your class on your sleeve, literally. So it's something that we still do. It's an experience that we have. And it's, again, part of that identity, of that self-expression, that self-identity that we carry around with us and impacts our experiences in the social world. With that, we're also going to talk about social stratification. So that idea that depending on where you fall in that hierarchy, you're going to, it's going to be a stratified system. Not all of those same groups are going to be equal. And it's usually going to go in that hierarchical structure where one's at the top and then it proceeds to come down, right? And when we get into class and we really get into talking about capitalism as a structure and patriarchy and really how all of these things tie into a nice little bubble, really the social theorist that we consistently are going to be utilizing, and it's one that we'll probably utilize a lot in the next several of chapters, is going to be Marx. So Karl Marx did most of his work really describing and trying to understand how the capitalist structure, that was really a big change that was happening, and moving from that feudal system to the capitalist system, really was changing social dynamics, and how those social dynamics then were going to impact society as a whole, and what we can do to create that social change to impact that. And this is really what Marx's idea is. Now, there's a lot of circulation of propaganda using this Marxist ideas. Here's the thing. Marx came up with the idea of what socialism and communism could look like, but what he failed to really recognize is the level of power and hierarchy that can carry over from capitalism into these other social structures. And his idea really broke down most of those. And so the communism or the even socialism that we see to small degrees embedded in some of our capitalist structure now, are not the same ideas that Marx proposed. They're not going to be looking at the same thing. And so this is a really important part of understanding the way in which we will use Marx theory and the way in which modern media has spun Marx's theory to be this derogatory kind of idea. What Marx did was really look at a market economic system and say, this is how it operates, and this is why it has to operate this way. And these are the essentially fail safes that aren't working in this structure. And this is the things we should worry about. And so he really talked about how social structure and specifically class structure was this relationship between the person and their means of production. And by means of the production, it was the thing that they were making, creating, whatever they were putting into the market as labor, well, even if it was their own labor, how much control do they have over what that's worth, over what profit it brings in, and how much of that profit they get back. So how much of that means of production do they actually have control over? And what he talked about was there's this distinct difference between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the proletariat were those who really did not have control of their means of production, that they generally worked for this bourgeoisie, that really were the people that had the money, the resources, the ability to drive what was created, what you got paid for helping create that. And they got essentially the capitalist funds back into them to recirculate and continue to profit off of that system. Now, one of these groups had the ability to kind of control their own fate to an extent within the system. And the vast majority of people fell into the category that did not. And that was going to create an inherent imbalance. It was going to create an imbalance in their ability to be able to work by their own hand, to be able to create long-term striving social power changes. And that was going to create an increase in wealth inequality and over time. And he was right. That's essentially what was happening. And what it allowed for was this exploitation of that proletariat class. It allowed for this working class to be able to be continually have their wages decrease to outbid and keep the margin of profit made for the bourgeoisie. They could keep cutting corners. They could keep making things less safe. They could keep making things cost less. They could use cheaper prices. They could get those resources in very icky ways. They could exploit the workers in the way that they were getting paid. And this is why for him, he really called for social changes in the form of things like unions, in the forms of more more organizations having kind of that structure of the working class, the people that were working had investment, had power in the ways in which the business was run. So a lot of your models that you might see of a company where all of the employees hold stock, and you used to see this in some old grocery stores. I know that I think Kroger tried to do it a while back, but it didn't really work out because they were still trying to profit so heavily at the top. It didn't structure right. But so those coalitions of workers that will end up essentially starting a company where that coalition of workers who makes money off of the stocks, off of the bottom line, right? And you don't see a whole lot of that because as a working business model in capitalism, if one person is not driving that super low rate, not exploiting both the resources, the time, and monopolizing that market, then that capitalist is not making the same amount of money, and then thus not being able to grow in the same ways, because the growth that comes out of capitalism is out of profit, not out of encouraging or creating a better workforce. And so Marx really talked about how much social inequality this was going to drive, and really how much this was going to create this elite body that wasn't necessarily the same as kings and royalty, where they got this power based on lineage or based on this God-given idea of right. but instead this was going to be power controlled by economic disparities. And so you're going to see a lot of very, 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 very rich people, or very, very, very rich corporations of people that are going to control how those markets, and then they're going to start impacting governments. They're going to start impacting religious ideas. They're going to start impacting media ideas to continue that cycle. And part of how they do this is keeping those in the working class pitted against each other. So keeping, like a good example of this would be how we think of farming in America. Well, America's farmings are not working, not because big corporations. If you ask most people in the farming industry, they're going to tell you, in their sociological studies to kind of talk about this, they're going to tell you that what's happening is not due to big industry taking over, but really it's because their jobs are getting undercut in other places, or they don't have enough laborers to work the fields, or the laborers that they do have to work the fields, they have to pay too much, or the taxes that they're getting on their products are too much. And all of this is a result of corporate power being able to drive the market, drive exactly what's going to cost, how it's going to cost, what you're going to be taxed. They're going to be able to lobby for things that benefit them in the way of resource gathering, in the way of ethical practices, in the way of standards and safety measures. And really, they're going to talk about this at a global level at this point, because at this point, we're such a global economy that we're not talking about just the corporations that run how America's capitalism goes. We're looking at capitalism as a whole, and we're looking at how that is impacted on a global scales. And so you're going to see things like outsourcing labor to third world countries, or putting factories and things in countries that have less safety standards because it's cheaper to do that, or less wage standards because it's cheaper to do that. And what you're going to see, though, is still a mass exploitation of workers in general, and this idea that those other social factors are more important, that people of color are taking your jobs as a white person, or that maybe at other periods and times it was that Irish were taking over German jobs, or it was we have all of these resources down in this particular region of the world, and so thus we have to go over there and maybe start a war or conquer this area in order to obtain those resources, in order for that corporation to be this, and we're going to do that at an expense of whatever human lives happen to be there. And all of this pitting against each other at the bottom level due to other social structures. Marx really talked about being really from this core conflict that is happening in class. And so for Marx, above all other social really conversations and identities, class was the one where the power distribution was most important to focus on and most important to change. And while there are and we're going to kind of get to that, because there are some feminist scholars that really kind of turn Marx on his head and say, well, yes, but on the flip side of that, when you talk about labor and you talk about who are the workers, you're still primarily talking about, even at a global level, class being run by the people who are allowed to be part of that labor force. And that doesn't always consider women. That doesn't always consider specific types of labor that happen and on a global level in ways that we're not really talking about. And we're going to get into that in just a second. But he worked with Frederick Engels, and they wrote Capitals, Volume 1, 2, and 3. They wrote a whole bunch of things together. And really what Engels did for Marx was to bring in how cultural systems do not inherently have the same inequality. So what he was looking at was really looking at anthropologists that were working in that era and talking about how labor systems were very, very different, depending on how what the system was set up on. So if you weren't running a capitalist system, or you were running more of an agricultural based system, or if you were still a hunter and gathering type tribe, was the inequality the same? And what they were noticing was that that was not the case, that inequality was driven by all of these factors that were tied towards resource building, towards resource hoarding, and really what that meant for the cultures in general. And that really got us to where Marxist feminists came into play. And what they were really talking about is how we socially reproduce these same hierarchies over multiple identities, and how these interact together to create this mix of elitist class power along with these other social inequitable hierarchies. And so they still focus on class as a means of social control, and still focus on how without those means and ability to really change their social wealth and the ability to have access to their labor, and that labor garner them positionality within the capitalist structure, that all of the other identities then compact their ability to maintain or pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But or all these ideas of what we consider part of capitalism is this: everybody's got a shot. If you work hard enough, you're going to get there. But what they are talking about is, well, if you have all these cards stacked against you, there's a good possibility that you're not going to get there, and it has nothing to do with your work ethic. And that's really what they were focusing on. So they were talking about a lot about generational labor, the unpaid labor and care work of women, of raising children, of the emotional labor, all the other labors of society that have to happen to maintain a society and to maintain a population, but that are unpaid and not really are considered inherent as part of this capitalist structure, as necessary to create those workers, to create this system, to keep it running. But they're unpaid in this system, and what that creates, what dynamics of inequality that specifically creates. And Marxist feminists really hone in on that. They also talk about the links between capitalist structures and patriarchy, and there are heavy lines there. And we're going to get into that again here in a little bit. And then they talk about labor is divided into gendered, racialized, and sexualized way. And by that, they mean that we have structured a system where, say, in the medical field, if you're female, people are going to steer you towards nursing. Whereas if you're male, people are going to steer you maybe more towards being a doctor. More importantly, given that same idea, if there are young persons of color looking to do the same thing, depending on where you're from, depending on where you're at, you're going to be steered probably completely out of the STEM and into something else. And you're going to be looked at as somebody who maybe has more value playing sports, or you're going to be driven into something else. And all of these things process our labor and our structure of how we make labor into these very gendered, racialized ways. And then you get into this discussion about the fact that we have got to a place in capitalism where the proletariat are making so little to continue that capitalist structure. We have now made it to almost impossible for a single income earning household really to be at that status level that you're supposed to ascribe to within the capitalist structure. And so they've made it a point where, in order to keep creating the system, and in order to keep you as a buying party, as somebody who's going to do the goods, buy the goods and services, which is part of the main job of the proletariat, is not only as a workforce, but also to keep it running by buying things, you also have to be a 2-income household. And that's a very big deal. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there for this one. And then we're going to go ahead and talk about terms and ideas here in just a few minutes, and then we're going to get into kind of the next bit. So I hope you're having a great week, and I will see you again in a minute.